the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, turmoil strikes a star empire, more pieces of the Grantville puzzle, and tales of the war beyond the next. Plus, we continue our ongoing audiobook serialization of Timothy Zahn's Cobra, all right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour. It's a pleasure to have you along. I am Baen Associate Editor and your podcast host, David Afsharirad. Today, we welcome a new interviewer to the podcast. Sean Patrick Hazlett has been on the podcast a few times, promoting the two anthologies he edited for Baen, Weird World War III and Weird World War IV. He is an Army veteran, speculative fiction writer and editor, and finance executive in the San Francisco Bay Area. He's a veteran podcast host as well. You can check out his podcast, Through a Glass Darkly, where he interviews national security experts, historians, writers, and other content creators on everything within the cultural zeitgeist. We are excited to have him as a part of the team here on the Baen Free Radio Hour. For his first interview, Sean spoke with David Weber, Jane Lindskold, Joelle Presby, and Jan Kotouč and Thomas Pope about the New Worlds of Honor anthology, What Price Victory. Today we will have part one of that interview, and part two will be next week. But first, the news. Let's take a look at the January mass market paperbacks. First up, A Call to Insurrection by David Weber, Timothy Zahn, and Thomas Pope. Not long ago, the star kingdom of Manticore was a small, unimportant interstellar backwater. Now Manticore has become a target. The star kingdom isn't certain who is attacking it or why, but one thing is certain. Manticore needs a capable space navy. And it needs allies, such as the relatively nearby Republic of Haven and the powerful, experienced Andermani Empire. Enter Travis Long and his wife Lisa. It is their task to build that navy. Opportunity for Manticore beckons, if Travis and Lisa can manage to navigate the fires of interstellar insurrection. Next is Grantville Gazette 9, edited by Eric Flint, Walt Boyce, and Joy Ward. When a cosmic disturbance hurls your town from 20th century West Virginia back to 17th century Europe and into the middle of the 30 Years' War, you have to adapt to survive. And the natives of that time period, faced with American technology and politics, need to be equally quick-witted, or at least survival-minded. Here's a generous helping of stories of Grantville, the American town lost in time and space, and its impact on the people and societies of a tumultuous age. And finally, we have Weird World War IV, edited by none other than Sean Patrick Hazlett. What if there were a war after Armageddon? How would the survivors emerging from World War III's radioactive slag heaps fight in this conflict? Wipe away the ashes of civilization and peer into a pit of atomic glass to witness the haunting visions of Weird World War IV from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. That's A Call to Insurrection, Grantville Gazette 9, and Weird World War IV, all available now in mass market paperbacks. And that's it for the news.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Sean Hazlett with the Baen Free Radio Hour, and I am here with a tremendous group of authors to discuss the new Honorverse anthology, What Price Victory. I'm here with David Weber, Jane Lindskold, Jan Kotouč, Thomas Pope, and Joelle Presby. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi there.
Let's start with David. David, I know unless somebody fell off a rock, this is probably not necessary, but if if you want to introduce yourself to the audience and
Hi, I'm David Weber. There you go.
Perfect.
Yeah. I write science fiction. And I think that's probably enough. Go.
Jane?
He's David Weber. He writes really good science fiction.
I like to think so.
I'm Jane Lindskold. I write science fiction and fantasy. I've got, 30-something solo and collaborative works out there. I've collaborated with David Weber, Roger Zelazny, and Fred Saberhagen, and over 80-something short stories. And I write for the fun of it. So this has been fun.
Oh, welcome, Jane. Thomas?
So I'm Tom Pope. I'm one of the co-founders of Bu9. We set everything up, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago to support David, support the Honorverse, and then sort of grew from there. I don't know that I would call myself an author per se. I'm more of an author's assistant. I do backstory generation, and I write a lot about the books. I don't write a lot that goes into the books. So I support the novels.
Let me say this. Tom is always overly modest about his contribution to the books. He doesn't put the final words on the page, but every single word that Tim and I put on the page has gone through Tom. And when it comes to, how shall I put this? Exterminating plot gerbils. Okay. He's really, really good at that and on keeping us on strain. The final spine of every story that Tim and I have done has been as much Tom's as it's been me or Tim, hugely. So do not go around being overly modest, Thomas. Okay.
I stand chastised.
Yes, well, that's why I had to speak up. Somebody had to chastise you. Okay.
Jan?
Okay, my name is Jan Kotouč. I'm a Czech writer of science fiction and alternative history. I have about 20 books written in Czech language, and 4 of them has been translated into English. And I've also done short stories, and yeah, I'm one of the founders of David's Czech fan club, or the Czech Honorverse fan club, which has since then merged with TRMN.
Welcome. Joelle?
Hi, I'm definitely the newbie of this group. Thanks to David and support from Tom and Jan, and also Jane has been incredibly supportive. My first solo novel seems to be doing really well. The Dabre Snake Launcher came out in November, and thank you to everybody. And I would also like to point out that David Weber also writes fantasy. In fact, there's a fantasy series called The Multiverse that I co-wrote a novel with him, and we've got a contract for, just 3 more books. So
Well,
I hope he continues to view himself as a fantasy writer.
I think of that one more as science fiction, not fantasy, but I did forget Norfressa when we were talking
Yes, and
about
that's an
stuff.
excellent fantasy series.
Yeah.
And I also think of that as science fiction, but the readers who come up to me think of it as fantasy, and I don't like to argue with readers who are buying the book.
When I first,
It's fair.
when I first met Weber, he actually wanted to write epic fantasy. That was the direction. He spent many long hours telling me about wizards and staffs and wands and galloping horses and all the rest. So I always think of him as both a science fiction and a fantasy writer as well.
All right. Well, let's get into the meat here. And let's start with the first story in this anthology called Traitor. And Tom, that's by you and Timothy Zahn. And the tag I like to associate this one, I'll probably butcher it, is kind of the nectar of nepotism. You want to say a little bit about this, and just give readers a tease? I obviously don't give away
Yeah, so the
plot,
the
but-
goal was, and this is something that Tim could have answered a lot better, because he really, he's, the way we work is that I sort of build these foundations and I build these structures, and we have this overarching story, and then we talk about where we can put, or this overarching piece of the universe, the bits here that I've been working on more in the past, and then we figure out where we can put interesting stories. And this is one that he'd wanted to tell for quite some time. He knew when we introduced Cutler Jensen in the very beginning that there was a story there. There's a reason why he was there. There's a reason why he was doing what he was doing. There is a reason for his incompetence in the end. And so for a long time, this has been a story that we really wanted to tell, and this seemed to be a really good place for it. We didn't have any prequel novels. We didn't have any prequels to prequels to write, so this seemed like a really good place to put that. And just sort of trying to introduce, Gustav Andermann had so many people around him as he came into greatness and founded the empire, and and all the things he did. And so this gave us a chance to tell a story about the pieces we don't see as much. Like everybody talks in the history books and honors time, everybody's talking about how amazing and eccentric he was, but he was this crazy warlord who went a little bit off the deep end, but also founded this incredibly powerful empire that still lasts to this day and is a major power in the Honorverse. But there's a lot of backstory to that. There's a lot of kind of the personal feelings, and so we get a chance to meet him and to meet his son and to meet some of the people around him. And that was a lot of fun to explore that.
One of the things that has been really good about this short story and the entire series that the three of us are working on, sub-series, is the way that it has allowed an expansion of a reveal, if you will, of the early history of the Andermanni, who I've always thought of as one of the more interesting and eccentric corners of the Honorverse. When I was first thinking about doing anything that would be set this early in the Honorverse, I wanted it to have a different feel from the books that were written covering honors time, that were all in my voice. And Tim, who had done with Tom a short story for one of the earlier anthologies that was set in the right time period, has always been one of my favorite authors and a good friend. And so I asked him if he would be interested in working with me and Tom on this. It has been a Sisyphean task for Tim because he got sucked into the Weber orbit, which does everybody here knows what that means, kind of thing. But I think he and Tom have done really, really well with this. Although I was a little bit surprised because I had expected to be spending, and this is not a complaint, this is something that I'm happy about, but my original thought had been that we would be much more closely focused on Travis and staying at home with the events in the Star Kingdom without getting as deeply into what's going on over in the Andermann Empire as we got. I think it's wonderful where we've gone because we're getting the development in the Star Kingdom that I wanted. But we're also opening this window wider than I had anticipated into the Andermanni.
Than any of us had, really. I mean, I didn't, when we started this, when I wrote the original tech Bible for the short story that turned into the tech Bible for the series, we didn't, we really didn't talk about them much. They were there. We knew they were there. We knew that Gustav was around, but it wasn't important until it started. It just sort of kind of evolved that way.
Until it got important for Travis.
Until it got important for Travis. I mean, I think, we kind of found out the same time he did. It's like, oh, this, there are reasons to go here. And we've managed to, and we're starting to build more and more interesting connections that we didn't have between the empires in the early days, between the Empire and the Star Kingdom.
A lot of people have not yet picked up on the fact that Sinead Terekhov, Avarch Terekhov's wife, is directly descended from both Chomps and Travis, and that the family yacht is named the Kaiser's Gift. It just, if anybody's paying attention.
One thing I really enjoyed about this particular story, Tom, is the way that a conspiracy forms. It's not, if you read the history books of, even our history, it always seems like, oh, this is obvious. This is obvious what the conclusion was going to be. Why would somebody do this? Why would they go through it? But the story, I think, does an amazing job of looking at the nuance, looking at how a conspiracy is presented to somebody on the inside. And if you want to say more about that, or kind of how you thought about that, and also just making people who are otherwise unsavory people, kind of give them their looking at the world through their lens, and allowing the reader to sympathize with that.
Oof. So the answer, I have a really short answer to that. That was all Tim. Tim is brilliant at that. I mean, this is his superpower when it comes to writing. And one of the reasons why I've always loved his writing is that he can get into people's heads in a way and show things that I could sort of imagine it, and it makes perfect sense at the end, but I don't know if I could ever build that. I can support it. But that was very much him just trying to, especially the backstory of, we talked about, of course, we knew, where Gustav was, and we knew where, that there's a lot of people have to be looking kind of sideways at this guy who's mandating an entire, not a dead language, but a completely new language for the entire empire, who's wearing literally powdered wigs around and dressing in period garb, and thinks he is the reincarnation of Frederick the Great. When we get to the second half of the story, we see his home, which is a direct replica of Frederick the Great's summer home, Sanssouci, I believe, but Gustav named it Sorgenfrei. It means worry-free either way. I figured Gustav wouldn't have stuck with the original French, but it is exactly that. I have a map of that from some of the archives. Someday I'd love to go visit there, because it looks like a beautiful place. And so we built this map, and I tried to figure out how he would use this, and then how he modernized it, how he put all of these things together, and how he lives there, but also uses that to run his empire. So I did a lot of the work there, but when we really talk about the conspiracy and how people are looking at him, and how people are looking at what they think he's doing to the empire and to the navy and to their future, that's very, very much Tim. And I can't answer that nearly as well.
And if you have something what takeaway would you and if you spoke if you spoke for Tim, what takeaway would you want readers to have of this particular story?
I think it's the understanding that perceptions differ so much, and what one person sees is not what another person sees, and sometimes that is forced. Sometimes we lie, sometimes we do that on purpose, and sometimes it just is. And that's what I love about this story, is just sort of seeing the same events through multiple eyes. And that, again, this is what I've always loved about Tim's writing, is that ability to show that.
Something that I've loved Tim's writing for a long time. Something that I hadn't realized until we started working together is that he never uses first person internal point of view, ever. And he still manages to get you inside the characters, what they're thinking and doing, okay, without ever having their actual thoughts exposed to the reader, which is it's difficult to do. I think it's his natural writing voice. It would be incredibly difficult for me to do that. Let me also just add that Tom's superpower is keeping all of our balls in the air at once. The other thing that had kept me from doing these earlier novels solo is the need to make the technology 300-400 years less well developed. Okay, because I had such a firm picture in my mind of what it was like by honors time. Okay, so backtracking to, and Tom and I did a lot of talking back and forth, because I had the major points of how I wanted it to differ in my head, but I hadn't worked through all of the implications of them and what it would mean for tactical doctrine. At the same time, something that Tim hadn't fully internalized when we started was that even though we're 300 or 400 years earlier than honors time, we're 700, 800 years into the development of interstellar warfare. And so he would come up with an occasional brilliant idea that somebody was going to have for the very first time in the novel. And we're like, they had 700 years to work on that. So we need to incorporate the idea, but how do we do it? And we do it by having a character on the other side totally disregard the possibility that somebody is doing something because it's an old chestnut. Nobody would dare to do it. And it worked beautifully. But we had to kind of work around that because of the fact that we're coming at it from different perspectives on how long people have had to develop stuff.
Exactly. And we used one of those in the early part of the novel as well. There's a doctrinal change, or at least a doctrinal evolution that was sort of part of the core of the early story.
Mm-hmm.
And Dave, that raises actually a really good question. So as an aside, in terms of this overall anthology, what's kind of the unifying tie between the stories? Is it kind of a period in time? Is it earlier developments of some of the empires? How would you describe it?
I think that what this one is really about, okay, they're scattered in time. Okay, Tim's is from the area, the Star Kingdom Ascendant period, 300, 400 years before Honor's life. Joelle's is from the time of the Oyster Bay, the aftermath of
PD.
Oyster Bay. Yeah. Jane's is from very close to the same time, about 50 years maybe behind or ahead, I think, of where Travis is right this minute. And Jan's is in Silesia in the interval between really the shooting war between the Havenite, in the interval between during the High Ridge peace.
I think it's a few months after the resumption of hostilities.
Yeah, shortly after War of Honor.
Yeah.
Okay, and mine is set it's set 40 years before Basilisk Station because Honor hasn't been born yet, almost 50. So there's chronologically, we're kind of all over the landscape here. The main unifying trend is that these are all stories by authors who I like and wanted in the anthology. But if there is an overlying theme to this anthology, I would say that these books are much less about wars than they are about the human spirit and coping with adversity. Okay, Eve Chandler is putting herself back together again after devastating personal losses. Joelle's character is an expansion of the character set in a way from her obligated
Obligated service.
Obligated service. Tom's and Tim's are here we have, how did Jinson become who he became? How did this all work out? Jane and I, Jane more than me because she basically did the story. It's an early period in Stephanie Harrington's life and her growth. And that, I think, is probably the unifying theme, if there is one. You're not going to get a lot of exploding starships in this anthology. Yeah, okay. So one of us, the Czech, he had to, okay. But by and large, this one is less concerned with war, despite the title, than it is with how you achieve or fail to achieve victory on a much more personal level, I think. Would you guys say that's fair?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that theme resonates throughout, and particularly interpersonal conflict and handling interpersonal conflict and what people learn about people and how they change through these conflicts, I think is definitely an apt description of the stories.
I think in a lot of cases, it's what they learn about themselves that is most critical to what happens, or in Jin Sohn's case, don't learn about themselves, what they lie to themselves about. I think that would probably, Jin Sohn is one of the people I most love to hate. And the reason is, if you look at most of the villains in my writing, they are not responsibility takers. Anything that goes wrong is somebody else's fault. Okay. And they lack empathy with other human beings. Other human beings are not real to them. Other human beings are devices to be used for their advantage or not. Jin Sohn so qualifies under so many headings on that. He's right down there in Pavel Young territory as far as I'm concerned.
He is very much the hero of his own story.
Oh, well, we all are, I suppose, but yeah, that's one of the things that Tim does well. Steve Sterling, Jane and I both close friend. Steve on his Draka novels. Oh, when those came out.
Tonight.
Beg your pardon?
He's coming to dinner tonight.
Oh, well, tell him hello for us. Okay. We have not seen him at all since Jan died.
Yeah.
Anyway, when the Draka novels, if you haven't read them, by the way, they're very good. But when they first came out, everybody's like, oh, this is a white supremacist wet dream. He's obviously an awful, terrible, horrible person. And what they failed to grasp is that he had created villains who were the worst villains he could think of, but then he'd played fair with them. Okay. He gave you an exposition of how they became who they became. And people mistook that for he must sympathize with them to be able to write them this well. Okay. Tim has some of that same gift, that same ability to write this rotten, horrible person in a way that plays fair with that horrible, rotten person's internal geography. Okay. And I think that's a really, really, really good gift to have.
Well, it just in general adds verisimilitude to the story, because as you mentioned, David, we are everyone is the hero of their own stories, even the worst, villains.
Well, some of the most abusive people I've known are not the heroes of their own stories, and they're taking it out on the rest of the world. If you follow me. And those characters for me are harder to write than the ones who are the heroes of their own story, but they're there. And in real life, I think they're in many respects more destructive to the people around them, simply because they're lashing out at their own internal demons and taking it out on other people.
All right, let's move on to Jane's story, which I would probably characterize as tree cat murder mystery, but that's probably not fair. Jane, how would you describe it?
Well, you're not wrong, but I think you need to understand the background. One of the biggest challenges we have with doing the Stephanie Harrington prequels is that I can't do a lot of the things that go on later in the Honorverse because it's already been reserved that Honor and Nimitz are going to figure out things that. Yeah. So we're dealing with we're really dealing with a completely different universe. The Star Kingdom is not the power it will become later. Stephanie is living on a colony planet that is still recovering from a devastating plague. Not only don't most people know what a tree cat is, Stephanie and her ally group are desperate to protect the tree cats from being destroyed by people who would want to take over their land grant lands, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
So it's not a tree cat murder mystery. We're actually dealing with the complexities of Stephanie and Carl are the only people who realize that their tree cat companions are intelligent aliens. And at the same time that they're trying to deal with uncovering the fact that somebody whose death is about to be dismissed as a suicide is actually murder. They have to do it without revealing that the tree cats are the source of their information. So blah on you. You try and do this. It's not easy and it's not fun. Another thing we're dealing with here is—
It's fun to read, though.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's definitely fun to read. Yeah.
Well, it's
Oh,
not
fun to
fun.
read.
It's not fun for Stephanie and Carl, but if they wanted to have fun, they shouldn't have signed up for a David Lindskold collaboration.
Exactly. Another thing that we really were doing here is we predate everything. So this is the chance to take a look at a lot of the planets in their very early, relatively early stages. And the previous books, except for a short period where Carl and Stephanie go off to Manticore to go to school, we've been locked down on one particular comparatively, pastoral, if
Mhm.
you call, shoot the bunnies and cut down all the trees, pastoral planet. And so I really wanted to embrace the fact that they aren't living in rural 1950s idealized Midwest, but they're living in a 3-planet colony. What would it be like to take them? Stephanie's only, I think, just turned 16 in this book. To take a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old to another planet. They've grown up on a world that's full of forests, etc., and give them the challenge of trying to figure out a completely different world while trying to track down somebody who they think has killed somebody else, without letting on that the reason they know this is because they've got a telepath. It's really not it's not Miss Marple in space. Thank you very much.
One thing I think,
Marple, but it's not.
one thing I thought that was particularly effective about this story was with the tree cats and how you represent an alien species, because there's one pitfall many science fiction writers fall into when they write about an alien species is they anthropomorphize that species, and they also there's some superiority versus inferiority mismatch between the two. But I think the way that you portray the tree cats is, they might do some things not as well as humans, but they do other things exceptionally better. And I think you show that nuance really well. How did you, in constructing the story, make sure that you maintain that balance? Because like I said, I think it's exceptionally effective.
Thank you. You have to, where to start? This story comes after 3 novels. So I've had a lot of experience writing tree cats, because even though my name isn't on the cover of A Beautiful Friendship, Weber, happily roped me in early on to, he said, very generously, he said, you're going to be writing in this time period. I want you to see what I'm doing with it.
Mhm.
So this came after doing Fire Season and Tree Cat Wars. And Tree Cat Wars is very much about how very different tree cat culture is. So I was coming into it I also think I've always assumed that the reason one day on a hot New Mexico summer, when I was out picking beans in my garden and Weber called and said, hey, want to write Stephanie Harrington with me, is because he knows I do the other well. I don't think like a human. My most popular series, a lot of my main characters are wolves, and I've had people who work with wolves contact me and say, I love how the fact that your wolves are wolves, not idealized humans in furry form. So I think I can think like somebody, you talked about Tim Zahn getting well into the head of an antagonist. I do a really good job, I think, of getting into the head of things that aren't human. And so that's kind of how I work.
One of the biggest problems that it's always seemed to me when you're writing about an intelligent alien species, there have to be sufficient points of contact between that alien and a human for a human readership to comprehend what's going on and not feel like they're just. Steve White and I actually did a couple of novels with an alien species so alien it was even impossible to communicate with them, and they're more a force of nature than characters in the story. The main thing about the tree cats, and something that, because of the interface, the way that we communicate, humans communicate, cannot really be brought across. Jane and I are trying to do this, is they do not use words at all. We have to use words for their communication back and forth. The reason it took them so long to comprehend how humans communicate is that they communicate in data packets, if you will. Okay. And the reason they have so many flying things this and flying things that is that for them, when they think about an air car, they're thinking about a flying thing and they are sending boom. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Okay. But they don't have the handles that we have for breaking down the details to explain to another person. They're just communicating them to the other person. And then in addition, the information flow is tied up with the emotion flow, which is why it's impossible for a tree cat to lie to another tree cat. Until they met humans, the concept that somebody could actually tell an untruth was alien to them, not because of virtue on their part, but because it had never been possible for them to do it. And so when in my innocent youth, when I set out to create the tree cats, I had all this stuff in the back of my brain, but I hadn't really thought about all the implications it was going to have for storytelling when we had internal viewpoint characters who are tree cats. And Jane and I have done a lot in back and forth discussion and conversation and whatnot to build out the very bare bones concepts that I had for how tree cat society was organized and so forth from the get-go. I mean, when I first created Nimitz, he just he came with honor. Okay, and I didn't know exactly why he needed to be there, but he had to be there. And by the time I got halfway through Basilisk Station, I had begun to really and truly lay out who the tree cats were and how they function. But it wasn't until Nimitz brings Samantha home to the clan in one of the other anthologies that I really started getting into the internal dynamics of how the tree cat society is structured for the reader. And that was really all that Jane and I had as our starting point when we started going back to build the steps that led to that relationship, that mutual understanding of human and tree cat by that later date. I have to say, guys, I originally projected the Honorverse to go about 8 novels. Okay, I had no idea, where this was going to go. I love building worlds. Okay. And this one, from my original tech Bible, which was maybe 80,000 words, has just expanded. Tim down here in the lower left quadrant of my screen bears much responsibility for the codification of the stuff that's accreted on top of the original tech Bible. But really, everybody who's ever contributed to one of these anthologies has done that too, because I've incorporated the vast majority of the the anthology short fiction has been incorporated into the canon of the Honorverse.
Yeah.
And it's been it's good for me to go outside my personal cave of Plato's cave in writing here, and get these other inputs into the Honorverse. Besides that, I've really enjoyed working with almost all of my collaborators and anthology contributors. It's been fun. I try to let these guys write the story that they need to write, with me basically saying, okay, here's the framework, here's how it has to fit into the overarching storyline. But I've always been a firm believer that if you're going to invite good writers to play in your universe, you have to let them write. And trying to micromanage. I mean, Jane and I, partly because of the fact that, and Tim and Tom and I have this going on too, we're setting ranging stakes for things that are fully developed by honors time. And it's actually easier to go from early to late than it is to go from late to early. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one of them is that you have to bear in mind there's 300 flipping years in here for things to develop. So your ranging stakes have to be put in a place that allow you to spend 300 years getting to where you are, rather than why didn't they get there next Tuesday? Okay. And that's harder than a lot of people might think.
Really, it's actually really hard. My other short fiction contributions to the Honorverse were set closer to honors time with Queen Elizabeth and her brother. And even that was a bit of a challenge because we had to make sure we didn't juggle things that hadn't happened. But so I didn't at first realize what we were up against with.
She didn't run screaming into the bean patch when I invited her.
No, and it's been good because when you get to, I like frontier. I mean, I live in New Mexico. I like frontier. I like working with the settlement of the Honorverse and the expansion of things. I'm married to an anthropologist. Again, that's this is a great place for me to be. And what you said, Sean, originally about keeping the ideas separate, once my brain can split into the two ways of seeing a situation, that the tree cats are going to go, I think my human is, or my two-leg is trying to figure something out about this, but how do I let them know when I'm not even sure what the question is? It becomes really delightful to see these two sympathetic but very different kinds of people working on bridging the gap between them. It's just, it's terrific without changing them from what they are.
Mm-hmm.
So I love that. I don't want the tree cats to become humans, and I don't really want the humans to become tree cats.
One thing that Jane didn't mention is Jane was the first person who specifically asked me if Roger had been assassinated, which is the reason that she got to write the short story in which he is assassinated. Okay. She was like, she I can't remember if it was in a phone conversation or an email, but she said, did Roger die of, was his death really an accident? Said, well, actually, no, it wasn't.
Yeah. So that's it. The reason this story is set in the Stephanie Carl timeline is because Weber asked me to do one. And he let me take them off planet, which is something I really wanted to do. So it was a great deal of fun. I would have been completely happy to have them just go play tourist, here's a hoop, but people reading the stories don't want to just go on a tour. So we had to throw something in for them to do.
I have
But
to say,
yeah.
Go, Jane. Go. I didn't mean to step
I
in.
was
Go.
just going to say, we've been on for 45 minutes already, and maybe other people need a chance to talk.
Well, let me throw one other thing in. I'm working on a current novel where somebody from Sphinx is visiting a friend from Griffin on Griffin in the middle of winter, and the Sphinxian says, "Only a lunatic or a griffin, but I repeat myself, would live on a planet with this climate."
Yeah, I think to that point, there's 2 points I wanted to make really quickly before I moved on about the story. The first is particularly about the point you just made, David, about I think the story does an amazing job of describing how someone might feel on going from a much higher G planet to 1.05 G planet, and also in describing the climate. And I definitely got I don't know where I got the vibe from this story about anthropology, but there's definitely, when you mentioned your husband being an anthropologist, I'm like, yep, that totally makes sense. I wouldn't even question it, because it definitely shines through in the story.
Yeah, he's an archaeologist, recently retired from the Museum of New Mexico. So it's a great resource to have.
All right. Well, and then the second thing, I said two things. The second thing is when I mentioned the way you handled the races, humans and tree cats. Also, I thought it was interesting how you had the humans reflect off the cues of the tree cats, and how, while they don't have telepathy, they've had to kind of develop this behaviorology, or it's not even a word, but like reading their behavior in order to communicate. So I thought that was also very interesting how you did that.
And I look forward to developing Stephanie and the other early tree cat adoptees with in mind that if you spend a lot of time learning how to read a completely non-human, you're also going to become pretty darn sensitive to reading humans. And I think that as Stephanie and her cohort grow up, they're going to be just a devastatingly cool group of people, because they've had a crash course in let's look for the nonverbal cues. And I think that that's going to be really fun to work with.
All right, let's move on to the Silesian command. I probably butchered that, but Jan, talk us through the Chandler Saga and what this story is about.
Well, I will start with the Silesian aspect, because I've always loved Silesia as a place in Honorverse, and it's like a failed state in space with lots of corruption, and maybe given the part of work I'm come from, it sort of reminds me of Eastern Europe. So it's even named like Silesia, and it's been really great. And we don't hear much about Silesia since the annexation in the mainline honor books. And I asked David about that. And we always hear from in the books like, yeah, they had to send these ships to Silesia, so we cannot use them here. Or I remember in the first Saganami book, the Admiral Kumalo is complaining that he's getting less ships than Silesia gets. And they say, oh, Admiral Sarnoff is really busy in Silesia. So I said, well, can I just write a story about that, like to see how busy they are there? And David said, sure, go for it. And so I had an idea of like renegade Heavenite officer getting in league with some dissatisfied former Silesian military people and former Silesian governors who know it cannot be business as usual with their corruption and piracy. And I would say that originally I was to say that the renegade officer has a sort of Napoleonic complex, but after the previous discussion and what Thomas said before, I would say that he has a Gustav Andermann complex. And he basically wants to found his own little kingdom somewhere on the outskirts of Silesia and gradually expand. And as the characters in the book and Eve Chandler discuss it at one point, they say, well, he cannot get away with it, can he? And I said, well, Gustav Andermann did. So this idea, and I really had a great time working with David and also with Tom, because I kept bombarding both of them with questions about Silesia. And then I don't remember, we established later that Eve Chandler is going to be the main character. And then I was asking questions about Eve Chandler, but I was left to my own devices as to developing her. I've even like, it's not mentioned in the story, but I've written like a list of careers, like what posting at which date she had. And then I send it to David and Tom.
Which I love that kind of thing. So it's in the archives with everything else.
I was like, yeah,
and of course, like with Eve, I really liked the character when she appeared in Short Victorious War, and it was one of the characters that sort of fell off the radar. So I asked if I could pick her up and do my own thing with her, and David graciously said yes. I think I basically did the same route as Eric Flint did with Anton
Zwick. Yes, absolutely. I was just thinking that.
Yeah, it was a minor character in the earlier books, and she's been very competent. She first been Honor's tactical officer, and later her XO, and basically acting captain for a long time while Honor was doing her thing in the field of dishonor. And I took a cue from what Lois McMaster Bujold says, like, what's the worst thing I can do to this character that they can survive and learn from? And so I think it would be interesting to like having her really coming to terms with a really terrible tragedy that happened to her, and that after 15 years of war probably happened to many people in the Star Kingdom of Manticore. And just make it long term, like not like she doesn't shrug it off in a week or in a month or even in a year. And so having it being slow and gradual and finding her own footing, or the feet under her,
I think
ground under her feet is the expression. Yeah.
One of the things that Jan did here is something that's very important to me as a writer of military fiction. And that is to show the costs involved. People do not do what Honor Harrington or Eve Chandler or Travis do and not carry scars from it. And that's one, to be honest, that's the main reason that Honor doesn't regenerate, because I wanted a physical avatar, if you will, of the price that she pays, that all military people who see combat pay for the rest of us. When Jan started developing Eve's backstory with the losses that she had taken and whatnot, that really resonated with me as a part of, it's kind of like if you write, I've said this before at conventions a lot, if you write military science fiction in which only characters you don't care about die, okay, and carry the scars, then it's splatter porn. And it is dishonest. It does a disservice to the characters. It does a disservice to the readers, and it does a disservice to people who form their understanding of what combat is about through what they read, see on TV, see on the news, rather than personal experience. And I thought that this story, in addition to the Havenite officer and why on the macro level there are these that are in this, this is one of the many snakes that Sarnow needs to club that are going on here. Did a really good job of that, but it also really resonated with me on that human level. It's good. Well, they're all good, or they wouldn't be here, but
And I remember me and David discussing it. I think we discussed the situation in Silesia, and it was on a convention, and it was on one of the Manticons, and we were in your hotel room, and we were talking a lot about like how do you decommission ships in the Honorverse, and what is the process, and what does the Silesian fleet composition is like, because it was in some of the earlier game books or something, not game books, like the game source books. And there's been some changes since then. And I remember that at like 1 a.m. Sharon said something like, guys, I would like to sleep.
She says that a lot of cards.
And now we bring you Timothy Zahn's Cobra. Earth's only hope was the Cobras. The colony worlds Adirondack and Silvern fell to the Troft forces almost without a struggle. Outnumbered and on the defensive, Earth made a desperate decision. It would attack the aliens not from space, but on the ground, with forces the Trofts did not even suspect. Thus were created the Cobras, a guerrilla force whose weapons were surgically implanted, invisible to the unsuspecting eye, yet undeniably deadly. But power brings temptation, and not all the Cobras could be trusted to fight for Earth alone. Johnny Moreau would learn the uses and abuses of his special abilities and what it truly meant to be a Cobra.
He woke to the impatient buzz of his alarm, and as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, the answer popped into his mind. For a moment he lay still, his mind busy sorting out details and possibilities. Then, rolling out of bed, he snared his phone and got the operator. Kenneth MacDonald, he told it. The wait was unusually long. MacDonald must have still been asleep. Yes, hello, his voice finally came. It's Johnny, Ken. I know what Challenor's up to. You do? MacDonald was suddenly alert. What? He's going to take over the Kotouč mines. Another long pause. Damn, MacDonald said at last. That has to be it. Over half of Aventine's rare earth elements alone come from there. All he'd have to do is use the mine's explosives cache to doomsday the shafts and entrances. Zhu would have to think long and hard about sending a massive force to evict him. And the longer Zhu hesitates, the weaker he looks, Johnny said. And the more likely some of Challenor's neutral Cobras will see him as the probable winner and shift sides. If enough do that, Zhu'll either have to capitulate or risk civil war. Yeah, damn. We've got to alert Capitalia. Get them to send the force up there before Challenor makes his move. Right. You want to call them or shall I? It'd be better if we were both on the line. Hang on. Let's see if I remember how to do this. There was a double click. Ariel, the operator said. The Governor General's office in Capitalia, MacDonald told it. I'm sorry, but I am unable to complete the call. Johnny blinked. Why not? I'm sorry, but I am unable to complete the call. Do you suppose the satellite's out of whack? Johnny suggested hopefully. Not likely, MacDonald growled. Operator, Syndic Powell Stewart's office in Rankin. I'm sorry, but I am unable to complete the call. And Rankin wasn't far enough away to require the communication satellite. So much for coincidence, Johnny said, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. How did Challenor get to the phone computer so fast? He could have done this any time in the past few days, MacDonald grunted. I doubt if anyone's needed to talk to Capitalia or Rankin lately. Certainly not since the courier ship left. Maybe that's why he sent Almo Pyre with notes instead of calling us from Thanksgiving, Johnny suggested, suddenly remembering. Maybe all out-of-town contact's been halted. Maybe. Listen, I don't like using this phone all of a sudden. Let's meet at Chris's shop in, say, half an hour. Right, half an hour. Johnny clicked off the phone, and for a moment he stared at the little box, wondering if anyone had been eavesdropping on the conversation. Unlikely. But if Challenor could fix the computer to block out-of-town calls, why not also set up something to monitor all in-town ones? Jumping out of bed, he began pulling on his clothes. One of Ariel's 2 fully qualified electronics technicians, Chris shared a 2-floor combination office, shop, storeroom near the roughly circular area in the center of town which was known, presumably for historical reasons, as the Square. Johnny got there early and waited nervously outside until Chris and MacDonald arrived with the keys. Let's get inside, MacDonald urged, glancing around at the handful of other people that had appeared on the streets as the village began its preparations for the new day. Challenor may have hired a spy or 2 in town. Inside, Chris turned on some lights and sank into her workbench chair, yawning prodigiously. Okay, we're here, she said. Now, would you care to explain what we needed me to do here on 5 hours sleep and 10 minutes notice? We're cut off from both Rankin and Capitalia, MacDonald told her. Challenor's apparently jinxed the phone computer. He went on to describe Johnny's idea about the Kotouč mines and their attempt to alert the authorities. Besides the water route up the Chalk River, the only land routes to the mines are the roads from Thanksgiving and Weald, he explained. Challenor's in position to block both of them, And if he can control the river here at Ariel, the Governor General won't have any way to move in forces or equipment except by air car. Damn him, Chris muttered, her eyes wide awake now and flashing sparks. If he's fouled up all the long-distance circuits, it'll probably take a week to repair the damage. Well, that answers my first question, MacDonald said grimly. Next question. Can you build a transmitter of any kind here that can bypass the operator entirely and run a signal to Capitalia via the satellite? In theory, sure. In practice, she shrugged. I haven't built a high-frequency focused beam transmitter since my first year at school. It would take at least 2 or 3 days' work, even assuming I've got all the necessary equipment. Can you use some of your spare telephone modules? Johnny suggested. That should at least save you some assembly time. Provided I don't overlap one of the regular frequencies and trigger a squelch reaction from the phone computer, yes. She nodded. Readjusting built-in freak settings may take just as long as building from scratch, but it's worth a try. Good. Get to work. MacDonald turned to Johnny. Even if Challenor didn't set up a flag to let him know when anyone tries to call Capitalia, we should assume he'll be moving against us soon. We'll need to alert Mayor Tyler and organize whatever we can in the way of resistance. Which is basically you and me, Johnny said. Plus those half-dozen pellet guns Chris mentioned last night. He saw Johnny's expression and shrugged uncomfortably. I know, living clay pigeons, but you know as well as I do that our nanocomputers react more slowly when faced with 2 or more simultaneous threats. It might just give us the edge we'll need. Maybe. All the ghosts of Adirondack were rising behind Johnny's eyes, civilians getting killed in crossfires. What would we be doing, trying to guard the road from Thanksgiving? MacDonald shook his head. There's no way we can keep them out. They can abandon the road whenever they please if they don't mind having to kill a spine leopard or 2 on the way into town and don't need to bring in any heavy equipment. No, the best we can hope for is to hold this building until Chris can finish a transmitter that'll bring help from Capitalia. Maybe we should try the innocent approach, too, Chris suggested, looking up from the book of circuit diagrams she had been paging through. As long as they haven't actually invaded yet, why don't we have someone, Dad for instance, try to drive through Thanksgiving to Sangral and call Capitalia from there? I doubt if Challenor's letting any traffic travel east from here, MacDonald said. But it's worth a try. You think your dad would be willing? Sure. She reached for her phone. Hesitated. Maybe I'd better just ask him to come over and then explain things once he gets here. Challenor may have put a monitor in the system. The call took half a minute. Eldjarn asked no questions and said he'd be there right away. As Chris broke the connection, MacDonald started for the door. I'm going to find the mayor, he said over his shoulder. Johnny, you stay here, just in case. I'll be back as soon as I can.
That was another installment in Timothy Zahn's Cobra, and that's it for the podcast. Thanks as always to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. Praise, thanks, and gratitude to David Weber, Jane Lindskold, Joelle Presby, Jan Kotek, and Thomas Pope, and welcome once again to Sean Patrick Hazlett. And good night, Tony Daniel, wherever you are. This is David F. Shirod coming to you from a soundproof bunker somewhere deep in the heart of Texas. Join us here next week at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.